Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. And what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about, I know you're all here because you know about Hyperledger. You might not know some of the history, so I thought I'd just walk you kind of through where it came from, and then kind of what we did this past year, and then some things coming up in this coming year that we'd love to have you all involved in. And apologies, I don't have slides. And apologies also for wearing a suit and tie. There's some sort of event going on the other side of the city that I had to be at, so, but I much prefer kind of the hoodie and t-shirt kind of look. Hyperledger. So, by the way, my background, I've been a part of different open source communities in one way or another since about 1991, when I first got on the net. And it was back at a time when the net was much more decentralized. That's a word we all love to use and we have different definitions for. But it was a time when people ran services from their desktops, from their workstations, right? You would run a mail server on it. You would run an FTP server, which was kind of a precursor to the web. And this idea of the internet as being this network of peers that are roughly equivalent, kind of all talking to each other, wasn't just a good idea. It was like the reality of the internet at the time. Yeah, there were mail servers, and yeah, there were DNS servers, and some degree of hierarchy, some minimum viable centralization, you might think of it that way. But this was before ICANN, this was before Yahoo, this was before Google, and kind of a lot of things that have kind of re-centralized a lot of what the internet has been about. And in my time, so I had a series of day jobs and then a series of night jobs. My day jobs were I started a couple of companies in the web technology space. I worked at Wired Magazine and got hit online. I put the first ad banner online, and don't shoot me, please. I've been apologizing for it since. But around the same time, a group of us who were working on web server technologies, kind of playing with this thing, started something called the Apache project, which became the Apache Software Foundation. And the whole idea there was that by giving you all software, A, you could answer your own questions, so you don't have to bother us anymore, right? And B, you could help us debug this, because we're software authors, but we can't find all of our own bugs, and so you'd love your help. And that eventually became a nonprofit organization to try to bring a degree of sustainability to this random, chaotic kind of mass of open source development. Fast forward now to 2004, and open source had kind of grown. Open source had been a lot of companies that started to adopt it, and there was an organization called the Open Source Development Labs that was trying to get companies to kind of play nice and sponsor different open source efforts, including things like the Linux operating system, and was struggling to do it, to figure out an appropriate model. That got rebooted a little bit later as the Linux Foundation. And so from about 2004, 2005 forward, the Linux Foundation has been a consortium of different companies focused on building common technologies and then building a commercial ecosystem on top of those common technologies. Obviously, initially with the Linux operating system, where having Linus Torvalds work there was important, but they couldn't afford to pay all of the other developers, right? So the idea was to have just a little bit of staff, but really try to organize the efforts of the thousands of volunteer developers out there. And then secondly, how do you keep Red Hat from trying to take down, the Debian project from trying to shoot down Canonical, and then with people like HP and IBM and all these other players in there, how do you keep them all from killing inadvertently or even intentionally the thing that makes this whole engine work, right? The fact that people can deploy Linux, deploy open source software for lots of different commercial reasons, and then if they're successful, feedback, improvements, feedback, new ideas, feedback, bug fixes, but also brand new work back into this virtuous cycle, right? So while the Linux Foundation was figuring this out, and the Apache Software Foundation kind of over here, and I was also on the board of the Mozilla Foundation, which does the Firefox browser, and I still am on that board. In parallel, I had a couple of companies, and then worked at the White House, worked at the World Economic Forum as CTO, and there, right about the late 2000s was when everything started going to the cloud, right? Which affected open source to some degree. It meant that fewer people were running the software themselves. They were kind of depending upon central cloud providers to run it for them. In other ways, open source became so common that it kind of became like, well, everybody releases code. Let's all do our own versions, and kind of like chaotic in that respect, right? But around 2013, I think there was a growing sense amongst people out there that things were getting too centralized. You know, that the number of people who knew how to run internet services was starting to shrink. That the number of places to have options for where to host a blog or where to host a mail server or run your own DNS, that was becoming a harder and harder thing to find. And that seemed to be something that was slipping away. It seemed like if that became too rarefied a skill set, then maybe the internet would become much less of an open space than before. So by 2016 in January, 2015 in December, after being at the World Economic Forum, I went to work at a VC firm, and I see, as I'm doing research now in Bitcoin and doing research in kind of blockchain technology, and somewhat skeptical of kind of the token-driven, kind of ICO-driven, hype-driven kind of nature of that, but really compelled by use cases in land titles or supply chain or these other things to try to build this kind of decentralized but still verifiable and immutable record of what is reality, what goes on in the real world, can we use it to trade assets, that sort of thing. I was intrigued by all these use cases people were talking about for blockchain, but I was like, does it have to be associated with kind of the scam artists and other things that you heard about even starting back then, right? And when I saw this announcement in December 2015, I was like, okay, this makes sense. And that was the Hyperledger announcement from the Linux Foundation, which in that time, between 2004 and 2015, had not only figured out, okay, how do we make the Linux ecosystem sustainable, right, and help provide an economic basis for thousands of devs to work on the kernel and other operating parts of the operating system, but it branched out into telco software, into cloud computing, into open source software that sits inside of automobiles, into all sorts of other projects, the Node.js Foundation and the JavaScript Foundation. And it seemed like there was a repeatable pattern here. And so this announcement comes out, right? This new project called Hyperledger, with backing from such open source software companies as JP Morgan and Hitachi and all these weird kind of names, and obviously IBM and Intel and others. And it kind of looked to me, and I'm 45 years old, so I get to say this, it looked like a 45-year-old showing up at a skateboard park with a brand new skateboard and elbow pads and knee pads without any scuffs on them, standing at the top of a ramp and saying, hey kids, hold my beer and watch this, right? And it was a little like the old guard wanting to be cool again by jumping into this hype thing called the blockchain. But what I found instead, after digging in and going to some of their kind of open meetings and such, was they kind of figured out the right idea, which was a way to build distributed ledger and smart contract systems in a way that did not depend upon public cryptocurrencies. Now, there was a lot to learn from Bitcoin and a lot to learn from Ethereum about how to do these kinds of things at scale. But fundamentally, it was a way of saying there's lots of these needs out there for figuring out how to get a community of organizations. And it could be banks, it could be people in a supply chain, it could simply be community organizations, right? To be able to sit around a virtual campfire and conduct transactions with each other, to record things that happen in their community in a way that after the fact is verifiable, that after the fact could be used in a court of law to prove something or simply as a way to conduct business. And without happening to different businesses, what happens in ride-hailing, for example, where one company like Uber or MyTaxi or whatever becomes like the center of that ecosystem and everyone just has to feed in and out of that. Instead, this is a way to build cooperative networks. So Hyperledger was announced December 2015. I finally decided to see, can I help, and joined as executive director in May of 2016. And surprisingly, the idea wasn't just to push one true vision of how to build blockchain technology. It was still so early on, and in some ways still is, that I felt pretty strongly that we needed to have Hyperledger be a home for a number of different projects, different ways of trying different ideas on how to build distributed ledgers and smart contracts. Because I didn't feel anybody, not Satoshi Nakamoto, not Vitalik Buterin, not Chris Ferris at IBM, I didn't feel anybody necessarily had all the right answers figured out just yet. And so, and I made sure to ask the community, because it's ultimately not up to me. It's not like a standard software company when you run a consortium. I'm much less of like a product manager or CEO than I am like a weatherman. You know, I can kind of say, here's what's interesting out there and what I think can be kind of channeled into what we do, but it's ultimately up to whoever shows up to our party, right? Whatever community emerges. So I asked the community, should we be kind of a multi-project kind of umbrella kind of thing? And kind of like what the Apache Software Foundation is and some other projects out there. And the answer was pretty clearly yes. And so within Hyperledger today, we've grown from initially 2 projects that you probably have heard of, Fabric, and another one called Sawtooth, to 12 different projects that cover the range from digital identity projects like Hyperledger Indy, you've heard about, something called Hyperledger Burrow, which is an implementation of the Ethereum smart contract engine, to all sorts of utilities and tools to be able to make using blockchain technology easier, from interoperability to performance tools to Composer, that you probably heard of, which is like an IDE for building that kind of thing. And the thing that unifies them, unlike Apache, which kind of will take any project that wants to show up, we felt it was important for this body to be a curated portfolio of different projects. And so when somebody wants to bring their project to Hyperledger and park it there, there's a pretty rigorous vetting process that goes through by the other members of the community. And it has to demonstrate this is something that's likely to build a multi-stakeholder community. It's one where there's likely to be vendors interested in providing support and other services around this. And it has to kind of nicely complement the other technologies, but it certainly can compete with them too. Now, this might look very chaotic and confusing to the outside world. It might look like, you know, like a dysfunctional family in some way, you know, where siblings compete for the attention of the public, right? And in some ways, Fabric and Sawtooth do compete in a lot of ways. But I also kind of feel innovation is messy, right? Innovation is kind of chaotic in that way. And our job is to try to bring in all these different ideas, different projects that have merit, and then figure out how to allow them to gradually kind of combine efforts and push each other, push the envelope a little bit, get some of that competitive juices going, but also make sure that we're really covering as much of the possible solution space as we can. Everything we do at Hyperledger, by the way, on the technology side is public-facing. None of this is backroom, smoke-filled backrooms, you know, where decisions get made and then pushed out, you know, after the fact. All of this is very public on our technical steering committee mailing list, in our different community chat rooms that we have. And obviously, all of this is about creating high-quality open source code that ultimately we hope enterprises adopt. Even if it starts out as very experimental, very kind of R&D focused, every project of Hyperledger we think of as being put on a conveyor belt to production release. So in 2018, we kind of reached what I would say is a kind of a proof point of being able to look out there and see a number of different things. One of those was every major cloud provider now, Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, the major ones in China, this is Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, and Huawei, as well as IBM's cloud and Oracle. All of these are now providing Fabric as a service, blockchain as a service essentially, but specifically Fabric nodes, which means now spinning up not only a dev or a pilot, but an actual production blockchain network is as easy as deploying any other AWS service. In fact, these companies are not just saying, here's a system image, you can run it on our cloud. They're saying, we're going to take ownership over helping you performance tune this, make sure it has high uptime, all those kinds of things. So that's pretty cool. And on the back of that, we've now seen, it's kind of hard to get a sense for this, but somewhere between 100 and 200 production networks out there running on top of Hyperledger. And these are everything from the Diamond blockchain you've probably heard about, to other supply chain networks in rice and fish, to trade finance networks that are doing billions of dollars a day in letters of credit being extended, other types of financial markets, as well as the Sovereign Foundations network that should go into production this quarter, I think, sometime later this quarter, which is a digital identity platform. So lots of really cool stuff spinning up, and it's reached that level where you don't have to say, well, this is experimental and put asterisks next to everything and tell people to be careful. No, there's real value being created on these networks now. It is still very much use at your own risk, and there's a really strong need for developers who understand the technology at something more than just a black box kind of level. So partly based on that, earlier this year we launched a certification program for Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Sawtooth administrators. Basically, it's a course that is available for free. We also work with training partners to deliver it on the ground. And then an exam that costs some money, but this is an exam where you log in and have to fix a broken Fabric instance, Fabric network. And if you can do that, you pass the exam. Our hope is that we can train and certify 1,000 developers this year. Some say that's a really big number. Some say that it's a really small number. For me, that's a number that signifies that this is a space that has not only the people who can service the needs, but the demand for that kind of talent as well. So in other ways we're growing, so I mentioned when the project first launched, there were these blue chip names that looked a little bizarre to me. Well, we've since grown to almost 300 different organizations that are part of Hyperledger, from banks and from IT companies and healthcare companies to startup companies in all sorts of different domains, to universities and government organizations, to central banks. There's a lot of really intense diversity to this. In fact, 40% of our members are based in Asia. I'd say even 20% are headquartered in mainland China. And so building a project that can span like the Great Firewall, so to speak, and truly be thought of as a global project, in fact, another 30% are based here in Europe, is really important to me. Because it's not Silicon Valley driving blockchain technology, to be honest. The companies that are based in Silicon Valley have no problem thinking of themselves as the center of the universe. And for them, blockchain technology doesn't matter. You know, why? Of course, you just allow us to run the network, allow us to be the central database. So why do you need blockchain, right? Although now they're starting to wake up to it. Now they're realizing that there are things that certain companies and sectors don't want to trust them to be. You know, no one wants Gmail to start storing medical records for you, right? So we're seeing a lot of continued expansion beyond financial services, beyond other fields, and so that's where, like, we're here at Mobile World Congress. The telco space is really interested in this for a whole number of different uses. T-Mobile actually announced some things today in using smart contracts for roaming agreements as a way to just get smarter about how to manage that and cut down on mobile roaming fraud, to a blockchain wallet kind of concept that uses self-sovereign identity and Hyperledger Indy under the covers. And then there's other groups looking at number portability, anti-spam stuff, some really interesting applications there. And then, so going forward this year, 2019, a lot of this stuff is still just about linear growth. Growth in moving more of the projects like Hyperledger Indy and Burrow and maybe even Aroha to production release. Growth in the number of, hopefully, clouds that are running and providing these technologies as a service. So it's easier for devs to go and spin these up and be able to tell their boss, no, don't worry. AWS will help us make sure that this stuff stays up and runs very happy. I should mention, I see another place where we're growing being, you know, if to this point we've been really focused on the plumbing, on the kind of, on things at like the level of Fabric and Sawtooth, which are just general purpose platforms. And I think we'll see this year us going up the stack. So at the end of last year, we introduced a new project called Hyperledger Grid. And the name kind of was decided by the developers. We kind of pushed back a bit and asked for something more creative, but they came back with Grid. Okay, great. So Hyperledger Grid is a platform for building supply chain networks. It builds on top of Sawtooth. It uses a new programming language called WebAssembly, which is what it looks like the Ethereum community will be moving to for their next generation smart contract language after Solidity, right? And it actually came in from a very old school company called Cargill, which is this agricultural giant based in the Midwest in the United States, but has operations all over the world, along with some other retailers as well as Intel and a bunch of startups. And so this is a toolkit that now makes it really easy to do a whole range of use cases. And I bet we'll see more things like that make building blockchain applications easier, that make plugging into common use cases that much easier, and really drive sharing between organizations that are building these blockchain networks in the first place. And I think we've kind of found the right kind of model. I mean, there's still a lot of hard work to do with community building, with recruiting of new developers, and bringing them in to be co-developers on the project, perhaps even co-maintainers. We've had about 800 different people over the last few years contribute code in one way or another. And there are some companies like IBM that spend a lot of time and money putting code into these open source packages that we all get to benefit from. But we're really keen to try to broaden that contributor base as much as we can from a resiliency point of view and from a market adoption point of view, and just to help establish these platforms as standards in their domains. Coming up, you did hear Laura mention a little bit about the internship program. So we are really looking for, right now, for mentors who can propose projects for our internship program. The internship program, this is the third year we're doing this. This is running during the summer, and we go out and recruit students. But what we need right now are about 15 different people to propose projects that they're willing to act as mentors on, to review the work of a student and then approve that they've hit certain milestones. We put money in from Hyperledger. We put in $5,000 per mentor. $5,000 per mentee. The mentor doesn't get paid, sorry, the student does. And these students, they can come from the US or Europe, but they can come from India and China, where $5,000 means quite a bit. So if you're working on different pieces, or you see something in the Hyperledger Jira bug database that needs fixing and you're willing to help mentor, please talk with us. We've got until the end of next week to get these proposals in. There's a lot of other stuff happening too, but why don't I take a break, because I've been talking for about 3 hours, and just see if there's some questions out there. If people want more of an understanding of who we are as an organization, how we work, and how to get involved. Any questions? Yes.
Just hoping somebody else go first. I haven't checked on the block space or the blockchain radar in, say, 6 months now, but listening to you talk, I get a sense that the organization, Hyperledger, is trying to cover a breadth, being selective about what gets included and trying to do the best it can for a solid foundation. My recollection is, I don't remember if they were the Komodo project or there was another effort that was seeking to create, again, a platform that had the versatility and available diversity of tools for people to create what it sounds like in a similar direction. So my question at the moment is, this sounds great. I'm curious if you're aware of that other project and how you see what they might be better, what use cases might be better for them and what particulars, or are you just aiming for the whole, anything possible that someone might need?
Are you asking for a competition, or are you asking what's the scope of what we do?
Do you see any fundamental difference between what you offer and what they offer?
I don't know who you're talking about.
Sorry, it was the Komodo.
Yeah. Komodo, okay.
In that case, take the question away.
Okay. So part of the question was kind of what's the scope of Hyperledger? And again, this might have been a place where if I had brought slides, it would have been a bit more of an interesting conversation. I apologize about that. But there is something you can find on the Hyperledger website, which kind of looks like a greenhouse that shows you the different projects. with kind of a tagline associated with them. And often knowing more about what the difference is between Sawtooth and Fabric does depend upon scratching the surface a little bit more and diving in. It's kind of like the difference between Postgres and MongoDB, right? They're both databases. You can build most apps that require a database using either one, but as devs, you really get to know the differences between them and make a choice in most circumstances. But yeah.
Sorry, and by extension of what you just said, Google, at the SharpGrind conference about a week or earlier this month, Chris Dixon was mentioning, in his perspective, blockchain technology is about the homebrew stage. And so we're talking apps and other stuff 2 years out. So I'm wondering, would you agree with that?
Okay, well, let me finish answering the first question, then I'll get to the second one. So the first question is really what's the scope of Hyperledger? And really, it's anything that has to do with smart contracts and distributed ledgers, right, that are kind of infrastructural and templatized, and we're not really going to be about end-user apps. If you want to write a medical records system that happens to use a blockchain to verify the integrity of documents, that's great. Some part of that might be appropriate in Hyperledger. Most of that should be on its own GitHub repo, right? So we're not really about finished end-user applications. It's still very much a developer-driven kind of thing, but the more that this is about building blocks and frameworks and stuff that makes it easy, ultimately, for people to build decentralized applications, the better, right? The second thing that we're not about is a token, right? So I felt pretty strongly that the community at the very beginning and kind of the culture we've built was not about saying there's one true network, there's one true mainnet, you know, or that we should be ICO funded or anything. Again, not to say that those are wrong for other organizations, those might be right, but just to help clarify that we're never going to put one set of our members in competition with the other in that way. People could go off and build networks on their own to do digital tokens and assets, but we're going to be focused on the software. And we're not even a standards body, right? We're not a governance organization. You go off and build your own blockchains as long as we're using the same software. Hopefully we'll get some economy of scale. And then finally, like, there's a lot of, you know, the decision that gets made by the technical steering committee, they tend to say no more often than they say yes to new project proposals. And we have like a Hyperledger Labs, which is a space for more like early stage kind of stuff, or just, you know, demo code, random experiments, you know, that might one day grow into something more full, but that's a pretty heavy scope already. We don't need to be a GitHub. There's already one of those. It's called GitHub. So, like, yeah. And then your second question again.
Second question. Oh yes, Chris Dixon and he correlated this, and this is.
Where are we right now in terms of the maturity of the space?
It can be applied for profitability ultimately.
Yeah. So over 100 networks running Hyperledger code in production, right? There's a trade finance network doing 1 billion Chinese renminbi a day in letters of credit, generating real revenue for the organizations involved in that. The diamond industry supply chain that's tracking the provenance of diamonds tracks a single-digit percentage of the total market, but that's still a huge number when you think about something as fundamental as that kind of change. And eventually that'll become a titling system. Eventually you'd be crazy to buy a diamond of larger than a few carats if somebody couldn't prove title to that diamond in the one or more of the diamond supply chain blockchains out there. So these things are real today. Now, would they stand up to a Harvard Business School case study on ROI? Are they overwhelmingly appropriate in every use case? Absolutely not, right? This is kind of at the level of the late 90s in the internet, where people are operating on strong intuition that there is revenue here, and enough evidence that, like, okay, given trend lines, this seems to work. And I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of use cases out there that are worth going after and pulling in. And that's where I think a lot of businesses agree. But it is early enough that we still don't have all the answers. Is there going to be only one true protocol, right? I think the answer is probably not. There'll probably be a mix, just like you have multiple languages, multiple databases out there. And so figuring out the interoperability kind of options is going to be pretty important. But stuff is coming together. Let me see if there's other questions you're looking at. Other questions?
I have a question about a specific project of Hyperledger,
okay.
which is in this case Indie. I was curious about the correlation between indie and sovereign, how much the community is orienting itself in developing one of those,
Sure.
and the fact that sovereign itself has a token. So in general, your efforts are more on sovereign, more on indie in general.
Well, let me describe the difference. So, remember I kind of mentioned that we didn't ourselves ever want to be a token. Well, think of this a bit more abstractly. In most technology organizations out there around that have been around the internet are in one of three different buckets, right? You're a standards body, like the Internet Engineering Task Force, or you're a governance organization, like ICANN, where you do all the politics required to help have one namespace that everyone can share around the domain name system, right? Or you're like an open source project, or even a vendor like creating software, right? And those three organizations, those three kinds of organizations, it's kind of important to keep them separated. When Apache got started in the early 90s, it was like being able to say that the HTTP protocol is defined over here, and all the competing vendors should get together there to talk about the standard, was different from saying, okay, we're going to build code over here that implements that standard. Because it allows us to, when somebody has a criticism of the standard, they can go over there. When they have a criticism of the code, because there's a bug in it, they can come over here. And that is just, it's a very liberating kind of thing that a lot of other organizations don't have. So in the Hyperledger Indy case, so Indy is the software that is used to build what are called DID ledger networks. And DID ledger networks are a way of connecting identities on one blockchain system to another using zero-knowledge proofs as a way to take, say, a passport issued over here and use it to apply for a job over here, right? Without creating like basically super cookies, across those two different networks. If all you had was a single ID number, kind of like the Aadhaar number, this is a big source of criticism in India of the digital identity system they built there, then basically everybody can link your activities, and it's just like cookies, right? So Sovereign is a network that uses Indy to build basically a running network, right? So they have stewards, they've got a whole process for onboarding new identity providers. That's very much a governance kind of function. There will be competitors to Sovereign. There are already, as a matter of fact, and I forget the names, version 1 or something like that, or some of you might know the names. Uport is also setting up another kind of network like that. But they're using the same standards. By the way, the DID standard, DKMS, those are being defined by the W3C and other interesting bodies. And then Indy is the software. And we hope that competitors will use the same software, because then we get economies of scale, just in the same way competitors might both use Linux, right? But that's the distinction between us and Sovereign. Now, Sovereign is doing a really good job at educating the world on what self-sovereign ID means. I like them as people and want to see them succeed. And so we've done a lot of projects together, but in no sense is it like an exclusive kind of thing. So, yeah. Yes, in the back.
So, we have some large traditional firms that have proprietary solutions backing you up, like IBM. So how does that, what is their stakes getting together with Linux and doing this kind of project? I mean, it's kind of weird looking at it from the outside.
Okay, well, I mean, open source has never been about requiring companies to be 100% all the IP they create goes out into the open. Almost every successful company that engages in open source uses open source software. Everybody uses open source software. Smart ones will sometimes contribute code back in, whether it's bug fixes or improvements. But every business still needs to define its core IP, right? Its core value. Maybe it's in being a better support organization, or being better at training, or something that's not about software code. But almost every open source company out there that I can think of, including people like Red Hat and Canonical, have software source code they keep to themselves and is part of their distinctive value add and the moat they build around their business. And so IBM has been a part of open source projects since 1998, and they also sell and license commercial software. There's no conflict of interest there. They simply say, in every product space there's a line. Below that, they give things away to create strategic opportunity, and above that, they write things to keep to themselves. So it's very natural that, just like with Linux, just like with other places, they'll build things up here and give away things down here. And they do this with Fabric. So IBM blockchain platform is the thing you can go to them, pay them money for, and have them handle a whole lot of things for you that you might have to do yourself. But then they have about 40 FT full-time equivalent developers down at this layer writing code and immediately checking in to repositories owned by Hyperledger. So I think every company is going to do that. And the question is, if you're on the boundary there, if you're writing code that is just above that line, and you're keeping that to yourself as proprietary code, you run the risk of waking up one day and discovering somebody else checking in code or making it available for free that obviates that need. So the really smart ones go further up the stack. Like the biggest Linux companies out there are probably Google and Facebook, who, they don't sell, shrink-wrapped, versions of Linux. They offer services way up here, and using Linux down here is a tactical advantage rather than a strategic thing, right? So that's the smartest thing for any company to do, I think. But there is room for people like IBM and SAP and all the clouds out there. One thing we do think about, though, is how do we guarantee that when they create these cloud services or additional services that they don't end up creating incompatible platforms, so that when somebody builds a blockchain app against Fabric, but it's Fabric hosted at IBM on IBM's blockchain platform, how do we make sure that that's portable to other systems, right? Or especially since the point of doing a blockchain network is to be a bit more decentralized than normal, the key thing is when you start a blockchain network, can you add nodes from other networks, right? From other clouds, from other service providers. And so this year we'll be introducing certification for the cloud providers who are deploying Hyperledger Fabric to basically force them to guarantee that if you start a blockchain project at one, you'll be able to add nodes from the others. At least that there will be no technical barrier to doing that. There may be a business barrier, like you can't add a node from a country because there's data residency requirements or GDPR rules or things like that. But at the very least, there'll be no technical barrier to adding nodes from one cloud to a blockchain hosted otherwise at another. Great questions. Maybe I'll take one more. Do we have time for one?
Yes.
Okay.
Mine.
Oh, take that. Sorry.
So, which challenge do you see now for the deployment?
Which are the big challenges for deployment? So we need more people trained up on Fabric and Sawtooth and the others to the point where they feel comfortable committing to their boss, yes, I know how to run this in a 5 nines, production kind of setting. And the cloud providers will help with that, for sure. But people simply need, water under the bridge. They need experience. And they need to see other people do it successfully, too, to take that risk. I think one of the other barriers that you don't see right at the beginning, but can become issues as you bring more organizations onto a blockchain. Well, first off, there's a barrier that there's no such thing as a blockchain for just one company, right? Yeah. Because the whole point of doing these apps is to build something that ties together the business activities and interests of a consortium of companies, right? So the best thing to do when you're building these apps is try to find something where there's already identified a common cause. Like maybe there's an existing consortium that's trying to solve a supply chain traceability problem, or trying to build a trade finance network or something like that. But then the real question becomes, as you build this, what's the governance model around those organizations that are on that blockchain, right? There's a lot of automated tools that help with the governance thing, like that prevent all sorts of categories of fraud. But really the question is, who do you appoint as like all these networks that are built using permissioned blockchain technology all have basically a bouncer at the door, right? Kind of like at a nightclub, you've got somebody who stands there and decides who gets to come in, right? And if you let in everybody who wants to come in, it's a very popular nightclub. But if you let everybody in, there's no room for anybody to dance, right? If you only let in 3 people, that's kind of a joke of a nightclub, right? The terms for when somebody can be added to a blockchain network, you want that to be open enough so that you get that kind of activity and liquidity and things like that. But if you have lots and lots of actors there, the opportunity for a few bad actors to kind of either DDoS the network or cause some problems start to grow very real. So these governance rules, like it's this mix of technology and human kind of governance, are, people are struggling to kind of figure out what that right model is. And so we're starting to think, should we put together best practices? Should we put together model agreements between parties? And I'm really interested in, how do you preserve the right to fork? How do you preserve the right to fire the bouncer at the nightclub? Because the bouncer is starting to, behind the scenes take $100 per person walking in, right? Or do other things that are unfair about managing that network. The only check on that kind of power is for parties on the network to be able to fork, as happens sometimes in the public cryptocurrency world, right? And go in a different direction when the governing entity no longer is operating in their interests. And so lots of interesting issues that I think we're just starting to touch there. Not a showstopper for getting these things launched and starting to build them if you have parties that genuinely want to do business with each other, but something to look at for more contested kinds of blockchain environments.
And so the deployment that they are right now in production, did they share the experience to how to set up the governance and upfront the rules?
Some folks are starting to talk about things that work or don't work. It's all still very anecdotal, but we're starting to talk to some business schools about systematically coming up with ways to evaluate how healthy these permission blockchain networks are from a governance point of view, from a maturity point of view, like how many transactions are they doing, let alone how happy are the participants, and how easy is it to add a new node, that sort of thing. So people are going to start figuring that out, I think, but it's still early days in that kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks for giving us a chance to talk. We're really happy to see Hyperledger Meetup communities in all these different places, and in our view, open source is about people. It's about the kind of face-to-face connections, even while we work in these decentralized global kinds of settings. And thank you, Laura, for putting these together and putting a regular kind of series. That's the important thing, is like every a month or every other month having a regular series of events. And I'm sure you could also welcome help in putting together future events and that sort of thing. So thank you for coming, and I'll be around to answer other questions.
Thank you.